No one's crying and yelling for a redistribution of Stanley Cups or Super Bowls or Academy Awards. They're applauded. Yay, these people are great. So that's true, but it's true in sports, it's true in arts and entertainment, but not in economics. Why? Welcome back, and this is the third of my three. There'll be integrations, I think you'll find. The first one I did was capitalism and the human environment. Second one, if you remember, was the ethics and economics of profit. Now I'm going to do something which will include philosophy as well, but a little bit of economics as well applied. The morality of inequality. So, as you know, typically inequality is seen as a bad thing, not as a good thing. So it's somewhat of a provocative title, intentionally so. This is a very common phrase for you foreign students there, the Declaration of Independence in America, 1776, where it says that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. All men are created equal. Very famous phrase, but are they? This includes women, by the way. Mankind. Created equal. So right away we have this idea, well, what do they mean by equal? All men are created equal. I mean, you could say very elementary way, physically? No, obviously not. Not in physiology or physique. Morally? Politically? Economically? What about economic prowess? Because one of the big inequality debates today is the distribution of income. Not so much the distribution of economic, political rights, right? Everyone can vote now. Universal voting. That seems to be equal. Whether elections are fair or free is one issue, but that's not an issue. It's heavily economic. So that's the first place to go, I think. Human nature, which I alluded to in the first lecture. What is equal or not equal in the animal world? Here's the non-rational animal world. I mean, they're almost clones of each other. Well, not almost, yeah. Within each animal group, just indecipherable. Which is not true of humans. But, all right, so they're animals, but they're not rational animals. And there's a fair amount of equality there, in appearance at least. But like within each, physical and other capabilities are identical. Now, if you go to rational animal, obviously the distinguishing feature is reason. The faculty of reason, exercised by the virtue of rationality, that is the distinguishing characteristic and feature of humans. So you could say, if you want to look for common features in this animal, all of them have this faculty. All of them have reason. All of them have free will, aka volition. Although that's disputed, right? The determinists. I'm not saying any of these aren't disputed, but just as let's stipulate, individuation. They're not cells in a bigger organism. They are individuals. Physically, which gives rise to the idea of individualism as an ism. Need for liberty, need for freedom, else you can't survive and thrive. So that goes back to my point about capitalism as the premier habitat for humanity. But now everything else is different. Lots of differences here. The size and shape of people, the height and weight, the race, the ethnicity, the sex, the gender, if you will. Since we have volition, the choice to think or not. Some people choose not to think. Now, they think, but they'll choose not to focus very much. Or they're myopic. They are short range instead of long range. Lots of options here. Choosing to act or not. Choosing to practice the virtues or vices. Choosing to be moral or not. They differ in aptitude, IQ, ambition, family background, work ethic, career choices. I mean, career choices alone. There should be massive inequality of income due to the career choices people make. I want to be a starving artist. No, I don't. Some will. I want to be a teacher. I want to be an astronaut. I want to be a venture capitalist. I mean, these are choices backed by aptitudes. It should not be surprising that there would be a difference in income. So, and lifespan, of course. Some people die early. And some people last longer, save more, and accumulate more. And bequeath their wealth to others. That causes inequality. Now, I'm going to speak more about what egalitarians believe, but it's a kind of equality of result. Not equality before the law, but equality, often called equality of outcome, equality of result. And I just want to point out something up top because it'll come through as I speak. It's a very interesting concept, the interrelationship with the rule of law. Because if the rule of law is equal treatment before the law, a really important principle of Anglo-American and other judicial systems, think of what equality of result must lead to if you really were pushing for it and even achieving it in some way. Since the natural condition would be inequality of result, to pressure for equality of result, you have to have inequality before the law. You have to differently and discriminatingly treat people to get a more equal result. See the point? Taxes is a perfect example. If you don't like the fact that there's millionaires and then a middle class and then a poorer class, that's an unequal result, right? You could have, instead of a 10% tax on everyone, which is equal treatment of everyone, you have a graduated income tax, or it's called progressive. 70%, 60% on the rich, 40% tax rate on the middle, 10% tax rate on the poor. See the idea? So that's unequal treatment, at least in the tax code. But it's an example of government unequally treating people because they want a more equal result. So that's just one example. There are thousands of examples. It was mentioned earlier today, affirmative action laws. We don't like the racial composition of this group or that profession or another profession. So we're going to change the laws and institute quotas and give favors or disfavors to certain groups. See how one sort of equality erodes the other. It has to. That's the aim. A couple of, 4 or 5 major points I'm going to make, just that I want to seed in your mind before I continue. On this argument, what is the argument, or what are the points here to that inequality is moral? If you start with the stipulation that human nature is the same for all, I've already alluded to that, the capacity for reason and volition, self-interest, individualism, capitalism, but then more specifically, we're not all created equal in all the ways I just mentioned. We aren't all created equal, but also we don't start that way, we don't end that way. But here's the key. It doesn't mean anything nefarious. It's a at minimum an innocuous result, or should be seen that way. It doesn't necessitate that people harm each other because they differ in their outcomes. In fact, some arguments going way back to Adam Smith said, the more the merrier, the more variety, the better. That's what the division of labor is. And specialization. What is specialization other than he grows food, he's a financier, she's a manufacturer. They're doing different things. If they all did the same thing, or all had to be self-sufficient, they would certainly be equal in their capacities and their activities and their results, but you'd have a primitive, stagnant society. So the goal is not might makes right. That's not a moral code. I already said some of this. People differ physically, mentally. Grounding this in the facts of reality is a much better argument than just, waxing poetic or getting angry about unequal results. If the unequal results are fact-based, at some point this opposition is anti-fact. It's anti-reality. It's not really ideology. Well, or it's bad ideology trying to trump the facts. Life choices, that's a crucial one. It's a fundamentally moral, not an inherently moral setup. Now, did you ever hear the phrase, it's very common in America, variety is the spice of life? Well, certain synonyms like synonyms, diversity, difference, variety, these are supposed to be celebrated on the campuses, right? The argument is, let's have a diversity. Let's have difference. Okay, yes, great. But you could really argue that the difference is not like some tangential thing, but spices are like something you throw on the meal at the end, change it at the margin. No, it's the main course. Variety is the essence of human life and interaction. You know, other than those first basics that I named, reason, volition, the need for a liberal environment, everything else is variety. And you could be celebrating it, or you could be regretting it or resenting it. And so variety, diversity, however you want to put it, it both reflects and causes our moral motivations. You know, all the specialization we do, our riches, our success, our differential success in surviving and thriving. So the moral can only really be defined and validated in terms of the human, and that which is good humanly is good morally. That is a secular case for where ethics comes from. Now I want to say, make these distinctions right up front, what I call the three different types of conceptions of equality. There's another one floating out there and becoming more and more important called equity. If we have time, we'll get to that. But three types of equality. This the most important, this the most objective, well, this the only objective. It's in the U.S. Constitution. It's over the building at the Supreme Court. Equal justice under law. And the 14th Amendment, by the way, a post-Civil War amendment after Lincoln. 14th Amendment, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, and property without due process or deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. That is why the image of Lady Justice, who's blind and holding the scale, what is she blind to? Biases. What else? Injustice, yeah. Is she blind, for example, to the evidence being presented in court? That this murderer did this thing on midnight. Not the evidence, not even the lawyer's arguments, right? She's hearing. She, the judge. It's blind not to facts, blind not to logic, blind not to the law, blind to who's standing in front of her. I didn't know, is that a woman or a man? Is that black or white, tall or short, Indian or Guatemalan? That's the face. You know what I mean? That's out. If you murdered someone. It doesn't matter whether you're tall or, you see, that's the idea. So it's not blindness across the board, obviously. Now look at these distinctions. What do you think of these? Equality before the law, equality of opportunity, and equality of result or outcome. And this is the first one I've been talking about. It's the principle that citizens be treated similarly in the law, in statutes, in judicial proceedings. So no special treatment, no favors or disfavors for specific groups or individuals. And it's typical of a rights-respecting, constitutionally limited government. I forget what I had to say here about rights. That's a separate point I've omitted today. Now, there is a concept of equality of opportunity. What do you think of that? This first one is totally legitimate. Has an objective basis. It's consistent with an objective rule of law. And it's going to definitely lead to or facilitate unequal results. So it's a kind of paradox, isn't it? We're going to treat you all equally before the law. And guess what? Since you're all different, the results will be different. But that's okay. And that's normal, and that's natural, and that's human. Now this one's in between, equality of opportunity versus equality of result. Here's the principle that although civil and economic rights are crucial, some citizens' rights ought to be abridged. Okay, already there's a violation of rights. This is the argument. As they're compelled to provide opportunities for others who lack them. So the state or someone should provide education, healthcare. Head Start is the name of a program in America for little kiddies in the kindergarten. But the whole panoply of the welfare state and the social safety net and all that. Or the concept sometimes used of everyone gets to start at home plate, if you know baseball. You start at home plate, not first or second or third. And the argument is rich people, rich kiddies who are born to rich and privileged parents, they start at third base. They have an advantage from the start. And we know in sports events, everyone's supposed to start at the starting line, right? But it doesn't seem to work that way in the real world, right? Because people have parents who bestow on them education and care and sometimes neglect. And so you're going to start out at a different place. The question is, are other people responsible for fixing and amending, fixing your position and equalizing it? And this is a big argument, right? And if the answer is no, you're also going to get more inequality, right? Especially if there's bequeathing. Bequeathing is a big thing. Intergenerational giving. By the way, not just of wealth. You're named in the estate of your parent, but in the education they give you, that you carry with you. and the heavy, if you know the history, the heavy taxation of inheritances is for this purpose, in part. And it's in the Communist Manifesto, by the way. Plank 8 or something is a heavy and progressive tax on inheritances. Because without that, there'll be an accumulation of wealth and exploitation of the poor by the rich. So this is the idea that there are like positive rights, not just life, liberty, property, the pursuit of happiness, leave me alone, where nobody's obligated to do anything other than leave you alone. This one kind of necessitates, no, you have to give me stuff. I have a right to education, healthcare, food, whatever. Except those things are produced by other people. So you're kind of implying that other people must work for you, which is a version of slavery. So this one definitely underlies a limited government respecting rights, functions limited to police, courts, and the military, the kind of a government Ayn Rand argued for. This middle one kind of definitely supports the welfare state, and the burgeoning, growing welfare state. This last one supports socialism. Flat out, heavy-handed, statist socialism. Equality of result. The egalitarian principle that all should have equal capacities, capabilities, incomes, wealth, and living standards, even if it's lower than would arise under the other conditions. See, the argument actually is if you say, is it okay to have inequality of result where the standard of living is up here versus everyone's equal but they're way down here? The egalitarian will say down here. They'll say, I don't care if this means, and I know it might mean, a more impoverished country. No, their priority is equality of result, even if it brings the whole system down, as it does, in terms of prosperity. So this one's more typical of authoritarian political regimes. Now, if you look at any country, there are measures of freedom and otherwise. They're going to have some mix of this, right? And some of this, in the middle, these mixed systems, these middle-of-the-road systems, come from these arguments. So like way on the extreme, they'll be pounding, arguing for egalitarian results, and the compromisers in between will say, oh, how about a Department of Education? How about a Department of Energy? How about a redistributive tax code? How about some trust busting? So make sure you distinguish these. You've probably heard these, but you haven't really worked out, like, what are they talking about? What is the difference between them? And then the next interesting thing to ask is, are they compatible? Because they all have the word equality in them. right? So you think to yourself, but gosh, if there's just versions of equality, they must be compatible. Or do they clash in some fundamental way? The answer is they clash in some fundamental way. This isn't the best representation of it, so if you have a better one, let me know. But I'm just playing around with this visually. A seesaw, what they call them in America, teeter-totters, or I think they call them teeter-totters. Notice what I've done here. The extent of equality of rights. That was the top one, equality before the law. That's what this is supposed to represent. That principle or the application of it. And over here, equality of result, what the egalitarians want. And I'm saying they're inversely related. They're necessarily inversely related. The more you have, the more you demand of this, the more you erode that. All right, here's an example. I said they're inversely related. So here would be an example. I don't know, I call it civilized society. What is civilized society? The more you have, the greater I'm calling it the extent of equality of rights. And in the British and Americans, it took many, many years to get to this principle and apply it in the law. So there's going to be degrees and extent of it, right? So if you think of it that way, the more and more you get that system, you're going to get less equality of results. See, this is like the extent of the equality of results going down, down, down. It's another way of saying inequality is widening. But it's got to, because you're protecting individuals equally more and more, if that makes sense. So this is a context that's more, well, obviously, individualist, capitalist, dynamic. In other words, it's natural to expect that system to coincide with greater inequality. It's not a paradox. It's not, nor is it something, by the way, gee, if we fix the result, we can still retain capitalism. No, you can't. They don't go together. They're literally inversely related. Now here I call the primitive situation, more tribalist instead of individualist, statist instead of liberal, socialist, stagnant results. And, T1 to T5, just over time, if you demand more and more equality of results, this burgeoning welfare state, this increasing redistribution of income to, fight against inequality. The interesting aspect of it is as I said before, you have to introduce discriminatory law. The extent of the equality of rights is going to go down. It starts deteriorating. Special treatment, special mistreatment, trust busting of only some companies, not all. So the rule of law erodes in this case. Put it this way, if the priority is equality of result, as it is among most egalitarians, it'll necessarily make the law and its applications ever more arbitrary, discriminatory. In other words, unequal treatment. To what? It's going to favor and subsidize friends. It's going to penalize and tax foes, which sounds a lot like what's called today cronyism. Cronyism, what's a crony? A special friend or group that gets favors. In America, they like to think of, Wall Street or big business as cronies, but I like to tell my college students, you're a bunch of cronies. And they're like, what? What do you mean? You get your student loans forgiven or canceled. The president's pandering to you and saying you don't have to pay your loans back. So you're a crony. You're like getting a special favor from the government. Happens all the time. It's all over the place. The successful enabler penalized, taxed, regulated, trust, and the other side is often subsidized, favored. Their debts are canceled. So these two go together. There are measures, by the way, of cronyism and corruption. They totally coincide. States that go this route. But I just wanted to emphasize, which is almost never emphasized, that the root of this really is the attempt to get equality of result. And that's unnatural, and that can only happen if you start twisting the laws to try to get the result. And as a result, you go from rule of law and liberty to rule of lawlessness and license. Any questions on that or thoughts? No. Do you have anything? Yeah? All right? All right, let's take a breath. By the way, the next few slides, I teach my students this. This just might be interesting from the standpoint of how do you teach this to non-liberty, not necessarily liberty people, but just regular students. I tell them, there are 3, and this is in the literature, that they'll be reading. And these are legitimate categories, but it might interest you that what they are and how I present it. There's 3 types of justice. This is going to relate to the equality argument. Distributive, retributive, and restorative. Distributive justice has to do with who gets what rewards and income and why. That's the most popular one. Why is that a billionaire? Why is that a poor person? Why am I in the middle class? How come I'm not earning a living wage or anything having to do, but it could be rewards too. Who gets Academy Awards versus not? Who gets, so not kind of non-monetary things, same thing. Rewards and benefits and income for good behavior, for good performance, good action. Now, retributive justice is crime and punishment. It's still justice, but it has to do with you do something bad, you get penalized. So the first one is rewards the good. The second is penalizes the bad. And the last one, interesting, I think it was Professor Hicks brought up reparations for slavery. Well, even apart from the issue of slavery and reparations, in the civil justice system, there's restoration all the time. He ran his car into my house and ruined it, and he owes me $30,000. He needs to restore. So you go to civil. It's not criminal. You go to civil court. This happens all the time. There's a whole civil court system, which looks at wrongs, torts, at the materiality, and makes a judgment of who owes who. That's a form of restorative justice. It's definitely justice. Making someone whole, for a loss you put on them. So just understanding that, now put it up against this, which is a separate issue, slightly. You get these 3 types of justice, but 2 models of how they should be handled. And one I call classical justice, and the other one I call social justice. Now, the classical justice I'll look a little more because I have a little bit on Aristotle. But just and notice I have blind justice, and here she's peeking. She's peeking a little bit under that. Give you a distinction. The bottom one's not good. There's concepts. What is classical justice? Starting in the ancient and Roman world, by the way, and mostly in Anglo-American jurisprudence. The concept of proportionality, we'll talk about that more. The idea of it's individualistic. They treat the individual, they're not the group. You can't have class action suits. That's possible, but you're treating the individual before the court, not a group. There's the issue of dessert, not what you eat after dinner, but like whether you earn or deserve something. It's very dessert-based. So you get what if you did the crime, you do the time, as they say. You're supposed to, so even if the results are unequal, at least there's proportionality, we'll say, and desert. And so unequal results are okay. And the restorative aspect is specific. Professor Hicks mentioned earlier, you don't hold entire groups or generations past for the sins and impose that on current people. They're not responsible for what their ancestors did. So it's specific in the sense if you can identify a perp and a victim objectively and materially, not loosely and vaguely, then that's part of classical justice. On almost every score, social justice is the reverse. That's why it's very invidious. It actually engages in disproportionality. I mentioned that in the tax code. It disproportionately treats people of different income levels with different tax rates. That's a form of disproportionality. But so is affirmative action and a whole bunch of other things. It's collectivist. It's willing to say that group is guilty and this other group must pay. So it's less individualist. By the way, that's why they call it social. It's social justice. Like when you hear social justice, you think, what happened to plain old justice? Why did we have to come up with a new modifier? For this reason, it's a more collectivist version of justice. Now, some people would say it's just not justice. I don't have to go there, but that it's a contradiction in terms. But the term is so widespread, it's just worth breaking down. Instead of desert, much more of a focus on its luck, its privilege, or its disprivilege, or its advantage or disadvantage. So all the language associated with the disadvantaged, or the privileged, or the unprivileged is luck-based. All the language is of the form of you don't deserve it. And by the way, that includes you don't deserve jail time. It isn't just you don't deserve that big paycheck. On the retributive side, it would be, did you shoplift $1,000 from California? So we'll let you go because you were poor, born poor. So you don't deserve to be penalized. You don't deserve to be jailed. No cash bail, the trend toward not punishing people for doing previously bad things. Definitely determinism, see how that would be related? I couldn't help myself. I'm not responsible for either my income or my bad behavior. I was determined by forces beyond my control. My Freudian instincts or my Skinnerian environment or my upbringing or peer pressure. And here, unequal results are not okay. Unacceptable, need a remedy. And the restorative part is more general. I mentioned that before. It's not specific. They're willing to have restorative. They're willing to have perps and victims. People not victimized by other people paying anyway. Recipients not harmed by others getting money anyway from those who didn't commit a crime against them. So 3 types of justice, all legitimate categories, but handled very differently by these 2 models. And this model is definitely marching through the legal systems of the West in a very invidious way. And it's part of the story I told earlier of the erosion of the rule of law. These are just a summary of the points. But look at this third point. This classical justice has roots in Aristotelian and Enlightenment ideas. I'll show you that in a minute. And focusing down here, social justice. I don't know if you know this, but if I were to just ask you, in the last 60 years, 70 years, where did the social justice paradigm come from? Most people would say Marx or socialism. It's not true. It comes from Catholicism. It comes from religion, particularly Catholicism. In Latin America for many years, in the 70s and 80s, they had something called liberation theology. Did you ever hear of that? It was a wedding of Jesus and Marx. So the liberation was Marx, and Jesus was the Christianity and Catholicism. It was a wedding of the two, which is interesting because one's supposed to be atheistic. But anyway, roots in Catholic teaching, liberation theology. A Jesuit, Luigi Tapparelli, actually coined the phrase social justice in the 1840s, the same decade as the Communist Manifesto came out. And he was drawing on the work of St. Thomas Aquinas. Now look at this quote by Oberon Herbert, which is interesting. Socialism is but Catholicism addressing itself not to the soul, but to the sense of man, to accept authority and sacrifice man. So see, that kind of thinking or that kind of premise would say, these guys are like allies, and they're not enemies, they're allies. And when they ally together, you get social justice conceptions, not classical justice systems. Here's another way of putting it. What is the opposite of justice? You could say mercy. Mercy coming out of the Judeo-Christian, mostly the Judeo. Turn the other cheek. Not an eye for an eye, but if your enemy strikes you, turn your cheek and let him strike the other cheek. That's not justice. That's let him go. That's forgiveness. That's a virtue on that side, right? So another way of thinking of this is that the distinction is the Aristotelian conception of justice as proportionality, which entails merit and desert. And I'll show you the simple math of that even Aristotle gives soon. It covers both distributive and retributive justice. And it justifies equal treatment before the law, and then, of course, unequal outcomes. But this other one reverses that. By the way, if all this is true, egalitarianism may not entail justice, but a form of injustice. That's kind of how I say it to students, but I think here I would say definitely entails injustice. Not may, might, let's think about it. The Aristotelian conception. Look at this quote from Aristotle on justice. The just, then, is a species of the proportionate. That's brilliant. Proportion being not a property only of the kind of number which consists of abstract units, but of number in general. For proportion is an equality of ratios and involves 4 terms at least. Professor Biondi will know where I'm getting. To see the source? A friend, a great scholar that's influenced all of us. This is from Nature, Justice, and Rights in Aristotle's Politics. But I am quoting Aristotle here. This, then, is what the just is, the proportional. And the unjust is what violates the proportion. In associations for exchange, this sort of justice does hold men together, reciprocity in accordance with a proportion, and not on the basis of precisely equal return. Justice is what virtue of the soul, which is distributed according to desert. Now, here's the analysis. Look at this. This is taken from the book, page 71. You get 2 people with XY performance of some kind. It's either moral performance, could be economic performance, and that determines their share. But see the setup he had is it's 4, 2, and 2. Where's the equality here? Right here. But it's equality of ratios. It's a very subtle point. Or you could put it this way: the merit of X, the desert, the merit. You've heard of merit as a kind of synonym for desert. Earning could be seen as the value of, so you have the shares, the value that they brought to bear, which isn't necessarily identical because they're 2 different people or 2 different factors. Bring it up to the political level, maybe. Therefore, the right of X contributes something, it's a certain value, they have a right to that. And it could be compensation, but it could be esteem. It could be awards. You could use the same thing for crime and punishment. X is a murderer, but Y is a pickpocket. Probably shouldn't have different results in the prison system. What did I say? I hope I said it that way. That's what I meant. Different crimes, different times, put it that way. Make sure you distinguish also moral desert. This is an argument from, is it truly deserved or merited? And legal entitlement. This comes up a lot with worthless heirs. Someone will say, why should Paris Hilton, that's an old example I realize, why should Paris Hilton inherit, millions from Mr. Hilton, who started all the hotel chains? He made the money and she's just a wastrel, spends all the money on. Well, it is his money, so it's truly, the real issue is it's his choice, but you could argue that she isn't morally worthy of the money, right? But she's legally entitled to it. So that's a kind of a subtlety where just because you can show or argue, and by the way, she might even admit, I haven't really earned this, but my daddy wants to give it to me. That's not a reason to dispossess Mr. Hilton. That's just a subtle distinction. Now, what are the criticisms? Since I've already argued, for the constituents of this, you can imagine what the criticisms of desert theory would be. There are arguments in the literature, nobody deserves anything. Not just some subgroup that we dislike, like the rich or the able. There is an argument in Rawls. John Rawls is very influential. that nobody really technically deserves anything because they didn't choose their birth status. What do you think of that argument? In effect, your parents choose you, but you don't choose your parents. You don't know what situation. Oh, I was born in Scarsdale, New York in 1959, and my parents were rich, and yay, I went to Harvard, and now I'm a Supreme Court justice. Versus somebody else was born in the middle of Africa, and you see the litany, and that's considered unfair. But interesting, morality, has to do with choice. Here's an argument that basically says you don't have the choice, and yet I'm still going to deem it unjust. So it's kind of a mix. I don't know if it's called mixing categories, but it's something like that. Moral judgment actually doesn't come into play at all in cases where you have no say in the matter. The other one's going to be, obviously, it's luck. So you don't deserve it because it's luck. It's random. The difficulty there is if you say, therefore somebody else deserves it. Why? If nobody deserves anything, you see where that has to go? You can't even argue for a welfare state. You can't go from nobody deserves their wealth, but by the way, we should redistribute wealth to people who really deserve it based on need. Because now you're reintroducing the idea of desert. So that's an inconsistency, but that's not the major problem. Notice how she ends this great quote with justice. She's an Aristotelian, but it's interesting. She said the moral justification for capitalism, it's the most just system in the ways we've been talking about. Equality before an objective legal system. It's not defended properly on an altruist claim that it represents the best way to, advance the common good. It's a collectivist justification and an altruistic one. It's not an individualist justification. She doesn't deny that, in general, you're going to get a growing economy and a prosperous economy in total macro results. But that is a kind of an apologetic or missing the point argument for capitalism. The capitalist argument is individualism. You remember those pillars I showed you yesterday? The pillars of the argument for capitalism is not collectivism or altruism, but individualism and egoism. This was one of the readings I gave you, and the students actually enjoy this because I say, I leverage off of the idea of diversity is great. But if you notice, almost every realm, diversity is celebrated. On campus, if the students look different, they're all over the world, come from all over the world. But in general, what do I say here? Differences in athletic and artistic talent are applauded all the time. And there's robust competitions, and some people win and some people lose. And no one's crying and yelling for a redistribution of Stanley Cups or Super Bowls or Academy Awards. They're applauded. There's big awards shows. Yay, these people are great. They're different from other people who are terrible actors. Okay, so that's true, but it's true in sports. It's true in arts and entertainment. It's true in the fine arts, but not in economics. Why? It's weird. It's a kind of bias and bigotry against commerce. In commerce, in economics, you don't have award shows for like best CEO of the year, wealthiest, most successful investor of the year, because they're seen as sociopaths or exploiters of those who have not. We should celebrate diversity and wealth too, but that contradiction is interesting because of the kind of latent bias against commerce and business. Even to this day, in an allegedly pro-capitalist advanced system, there's still that bias that you have. I want to do a little bit on economics for the economic students out there. If you know what marginal productivity theory is, it's probably the best rational argument given for why people get different pay. So this is not Marx's exploitation theory. You remember that one. The capitalist has more power and just lords it over the laborer. This is the argument that the extent to which you contribute to the productive outcome of a company, you'll get paid accordingly. but all the contributions aren't the same. The janitor isn't contributing the same as the middle manager, and the middle manager is not contributing as much as the senior executives. So that's something Ayn Rand called the pyramid of ability, and it totally inverts Marx. Because what's the Marxist view? That blue-collar or assembly line workers are people who get their hands dirty and they have calluses on their hands. They're the ones who create the wealth. And the white-collar, managerial, especially the higher up they go, are more parasitical. They're living off of the work done by others. In fact, that whole bottom group is called workers and laborers, and as you go up, they don't even call them workers and laborers anymore because apparently they don't work. Apparently CEOs and CFOs and strategists don't work or labor at all. So this is a theory that was first developed, believe it or not, in 1899 by John Bates Clark. So it's not like the history of economics is devoid of any attempt to show why pay would be different. And by the way, by implication, if a CEO makes $1 million and the janitor makes, 10,000, the multiple between the two, the implication would be that the CEO added that much more value to the company's worth, which can be measured in the stock market, as the janitor. Interestingly, if it's a bad CEO, it can also destroy much more wealth. See Enron or some of the other fantastic failures over the years. But it simply confirms the importance of that very top of the pyramid. Well, there's a quote from Clark. I won't put it on you, but to his great credit, the production, it's called the distribution of wealth, a theory of wages, interest, and profits. I showed you before earlier, those are some of the main four sources of income in an economy: wages, interest, profits. If you have a theory of profits and it's based on marginal productivity, you're talking about the receivers of profit actually producing something, not taking it from others, not stealing it from others. And that was exactly his theory. But it's been resisted by anti-capitalists ever since then. When is this? 1899. We're going on 125 years since this. Here's a cute example that you might like, even though there's a lot of numbers. I'm curious which company you'd like to work for. You have three choices here. And what I'm presenting here is, here's three companies, and they have a compensation system that's just or not just. And you have to figure out, I don't want to go to the one that's not just. Which one is he talking about? But it incorporates equality of opportunity, equality of result. So what's case number? Well, first of all, I'll show you what I'm doing. This is a factor of production. And in economics, that's just, it could be laborers, it could be equipment, but just assume it's 4 different people. But, it includes the other things that go into the factors of production. And assume that this is their product. This is how many widgets they produce, or how many apples. So you get the idea. So people, product, and then their pay. How much they get paid. So this is what marginal productivity theory is. It's the idea that your pay relates to your product. Does that make sense? I mean, you could do this for a professor. Show me how many articles you got published, and I'll pay you more than the dolt who did get nothing published. See the idea? Now, I've made this so you can more easily analyze it by the footings are the same. They both add up to 1,000 in product. 1,112? In product and in pay. Oh, by the way, then I ask, equal or not in each case? Horizontally or vertically? So I give you the answers. It's not a quiz. All right, so talk to me about how would you describe case one? Just in words. I work for this firm. This is what's going to happen. What would you say? How would you describe it?
I would say that if I was for the company that's on the case one, the amount of work that I'm doing, or hard that I'm putting out, every word I'm in.
Right.
If I'm building one device, then I get paid for that.
Seems fair. And if you are A, and next to you is D might say, God, I'm only getting 2. But you'd say, well, yeah, but you only produced 2. And I produce. So, okay, so what does this look like Aristotle? Where's the equality? It's not vertical, is it? It's horizontal. See what I'm saying? Is the product equal? No, not this way. Is this, no, that's not equal, but this is. There's a correspondence, a proportionality between product and pay. How would you describe this? They have the same, I have 4 different people. Well, maybe it's the same 4 people. They go over to company. They go over to company 2, and I'm like, okay, what's going on over here? There's still that much product. See, I'm trying to hold everything constant so you can see the difference. And I just divided that. So each one has to do 278. And if they each produce 270, and they'll get paid that. So what's the principle here? Is it equal vertically? Yeah. And in pay? And this way. Oh, it's equal across the board. Interesting company. All right, would you work here? No. Well, all right, let's move on. You got the principle that quickly? I'm glad. Same numbers. Notice how I've combined the two? It's the it's the performance of this dumped in there, but the pay of this dumped in there. It still adds up. I'm not changing the budget, but what would A do after about 2 days? Leave, run to the other company. Right, because they're making all this and earning only that. Who's going to stay and say, this is a great job? D, I'm staying. This is awesome. Unless all the others leave, and then the whole thing collapses. Yeah. Yeah. So, so you get the idea? I try to do this as a combination of learning the proportionality principle of Aristotle and its relationship to justice, but it also relates to inequality of the outcome, but that it's also an economic example, and it also integrates the marginal productivity of Clark. Questions? An egalitarian would look at this and say, terrible, the results are unequal. But you'd have to drop the context of how'd you get there? Here he'd say, wonderful. And yeah, no one's complaining. And here he'd say, wonderful, as the company shuts down, because they will lose A. They will definitely lose A, which is how much of the product? 90% of the product. That's as John Gall walking out of the 20th Century Motor Company. If you've read Atlas Shrugged, you know what that means.
I'm curious about if you go to case number 2.
Yeah.
Because I'm thinking about incentives for people who might want to apply to each of these different companies. What do you think is the incentives if somebody is drawn toward case 2? I'm curious about that.
Well, it depends on, are they actually that productive? You could imagine 4 people equally productive at that low level, and everyone would be happy, and I doubt there'd be any resentment. But if A can actually do that, A won't last. Even though A doesn't feel like they're being underpaid, they might say, I'm being underused, or, my potential isn't being fully. Does that make sense? I mean, this is so simplified that when you start digging into it, you're like, well, why would that be? Why would anyone show up to that company? So it's a little contrived, but.
Well, it depends on, it depends on what people want in their value structure. If it's like,
I don't want to work very hard. Yeah. Right.
Maybe I want to work part-time.
Right. Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
And that's enough for me.
Right.
So I could see what it depends on the context.
Yeah.
Part-time.
Yeah.
Or you don't want to work that hard. You'll settle for 2, and that's good for your context.
And this also suggests, wow, if I have an entry-level position, I might be able to work my way up in this company and become more productive and make more, so I'm more incentivized. Whereas this place is just full of mediocre people who all do the same thing or something like that.
Well, 1, I'd be more incentivized. 3, I want to avoid like the plague.
What do you got?
So there's this interesting phenomenon. You see some places where people would be like, let's use this example of you have the company 3, and instead of jumping from company 3 to company 1, like I produce 1,000, so I will get 1,000.
Uh-huh.
People find it easier or more it's more fulfilling to jump from 3 to 2 because then I'm still having the same pay, yet I work less. Instead of looking at I worked a lot and gain and then win a lot. So, yeah, just that's.
You think it is interesting, isn't it? Yeah. This is more on, I'm not going to go through all this is more on Rawls saying, it's your birth status, invalidate your claims to unequal income. And yet, here's the contradiction, the disadvantaged do deserve a redistribution of wealth. So that's a conflict. Either people do deserve things, now let's discuss, why is it different? Or on his view, if they don't deserve things, then they also don't deserve handouts under the welfare state. That's always been, I think, the major contradiction in Rawls. There are others, but this is intended more for a college class who has read Rawls and is trying to figure out what is Rawls saying, and why is there really just not a justification for unequal income? Notice by the bottom, by the way, arbitrary from a moral point of view. Your income is arbitrary from a moral point of view, but his moral point of view is a view that says you have no choice about your parents, which means morality really is off the table. So John Rawls made a major category mistake here. And thankfully, his colleague down the hallway, Nozick, 3 years later, defended unequal income, based mostly on the idea that if you're engaged in voluntary exchange, you are entitled to your wealth and income, whether you earn it or whether it's given to you as a gift by others. So it was a pretty decent defense. It has some weaknesses, but it definitely relies on proportionality and relies on the idea that we must increase the context and understand who made what, not just close the curtain and see who got what and show up in the paycheck. What did people do before they got? And if there's a connection between the two, it's perfectly justified. So Rawls tends to be the advocate, and all his followers, of the redistributive welfare state, and Nozick, the libertarian. So the idea that underlying ethical philosophy feeds into your politics is confirmed here. That was Ayn Rand's view. Here's an example of what, this is not Nozick's example, but it's my example. To distinguish Rawls and Nozick, a policeman pulls this woman over. See all the money? She's in a convertible, so you can see all this money in her car. Rawls looks at the picture and says, bad. That's way more money than other people in town have. That's it. It's the extent of the analysis. It's more than there's a differential in outcome. But Nozick says, how'd she get it? Maybe she just got a bonus she's driving home from Goldman Sachs, so she got a bonus. She doesn't look very happy, actually. So maybe it's not the bonus, but she's probably unhappy because she was pulled over. The guy's harassing her or something. She could have robbed a bank. Not good. Probably should be arrested. Doesn't deserve it. But in the first case, she deserves it. This is trickier. Lottery. She won the lottery. It's lottery winnings. What do you think of that? Earned, unearned? What would be the argument that it's unearned? There's luck. The luck of the draw, the luck, yeah. What would be the argument that she maybe not deserves it, but is entitled to it? She bought a lottery ticket, which is what? It's a contract. Here's my ticket. It has that number on it. You lottery commission said you would do this. And remember the difference between moral desert and legal entitlement? She's legal entitled. But you see the difference, though. You kind of widen the context. You can't just look at, hey, look at this distribution of income. It's unequal, therefore bad. No. You have to look at causality. In effect, a movie, not a picture in time. Rawls kind of takes a picture in time. All right. Fun with Rawls and Nozick. I'll skip by this, but this was one of the readings as well. The argument here was, here's this big inequality debate, and they're dropping the context of who earned the money or whether they did or not. In this case, this is a very weird case because it was during the Obama-Romney race for president in 2012. And Romney was a wealthy former financier, retired, running for president. So they didn't like the fact that he was still getting income from what? His investments. What's investment income? What form would it take? What's he getting? He's not getting wages. He's not punching a clock every day. Where's his income? Dividends and interest on bonds. Right, so he was criticized, including by Republicans, Newt Gingrich and other. He's a vulture capitalist. He's not a venture capitalist. He's just sitting there not working, and yet he's still making income, and he's not paying enough taxes and everything. So they were distinguishing between, he's literally not going to an assembly line every day and working. He's already worked and accumulated assets, and now he's lending that out. Remember, the capitalist and the lender, they lend out their assets to other people. These are very valuable assets. That's where he's getting his income. Granted, he's in retirement, but most people in retirement aren't still working on the whole point of retirement is not working anymore. But it doesn't mean living off your savings makes you a parasite. Living off the government makes you a parasite. So anyway, that's what that's about. Now, look at all these books. You see a common theme? That what? Inequality is a good thing or terrible? I mean, it's terrible. The inequality trap. Inequality, what can be done? There's very few defenses. The cost of inequality. There's very few books defending it. Now listen to this, Obama. It's the defining challenge of our time. It's dangerous. Spooky language. It's dangerous. There's a growing inequality and a lack of upward mobility, jeopardizing the American middle class. The deal that if you work hard and have a chance to get ahead, but increasingly equality poses a fundamental threat to the American dream, our way of life, what we stand for around the globe, unquote. Notice a complaint about inequality, but in the guise of, I'm for the American dream. And apparently other people are not. So Americans would fall for this because he's for the American dream. We'll see what that is in a moment. Here's a Nobel laureate, Stiglitz from Columbia. The large and growing inequality that's left the American social fabric fraying at the edges. The rich are getting richer while the rest of us are facing hardships that seem inconsistent with the American dream. There it is again, the American dream. I'm defending the American dream. Danger, here's another one. How today's divided society endangers our future. See the purple language, see the emotional language? Guess who coined the phrase the American dream? Since they were talking about the American dream. This guy, in 1931, just before the Great Depression occurred. The American dream that has lured tens of millions of all nations to our shores, so apparently it's an attractive thing. People would want to seek this. Has not been a dream of material plenty. That's interesting. Though that has doubtlessly counted heavily, it's been a dream of being able to grow to fullest development as a man and a woman, unhampered by the barriers which had slowly been erected in older civilizations, unrepressed by social orders which had developed for the benefit of classes rather than for the simple human being of any and every class. And here's another excerpt. The American dream is that dream of a land in which life should be better and richer and fuller for everyone, with opportunity for each, according to ability or achievement. That's the unquote, an interesting phrase. From each, according to his ability, gets paid. Does that phrase sound familiar? It's from the Communist Manifesto. No, from the Gotha program by Marx. That the distribution system in socialism would be, we tax people from each according to their ability. We take it from them and give it to people according to what? Their needs. Right. So the Marxist principle is ability, achievement, those are the ones who get taxed under my system. In Adams' case, he's saying, no, the American dream is you are free of these stultifying barriers of the old world. You come and you lead to differential results and get paid for it, and that's the dream. Now, if that dream is being eroded or impeded. That's definitely possible, right? But it's not due to unequal income. Unequal income is part of the dream. That is part of the dream. It's a feature of it, not a bug. But they're painting it as, no, this is threatening the American dream. Notice the language, by the way, very subtle. The riches accruing to those at the top have come at the expense of those down below. One can think about what's been happening in terms of a slice of pie. If the pie were equally divided, everyone would get a slice. So the top 1% would get 1% of the pie. 1% of the people would get 1%. See the idea? In fact, the top 1% get a fifth of the entire pie, 20%. Get. You just get it. Falling from manna from heaven. What's his premise? What's his? Yeah, one, that there's a pie. Fixed. Yeah, now we're slicing the fixed. There's another premise in there that society built the pie. Yeah, or you can't tell who did what. It's society made the pie. So one thing is there's a pie and there's a fixed and we're like fighting over slices. And if my slice is bigger, yours is smaller. What does that sound like? A couple days ago. What premise? The zero sum. Remember the zero sum premise I taught a couple days ago? The zero sum, well, there's a pie with different wedges. And, accrue is a very passive thing. The profits accrued to me. Did you make them? Did you earn them? Did you create anything? No, they just accrued to me. And I got them one day, magically, causelessly. So questions unanswered. Who produced this pie? Who organized the baking crew? Who brought the oven and the tools and the recipe, the intellectual part of it? Who put the recipe together? Doesn't matter. According to these guys, everyone should get the same slice, including the person who just cuts the crust at the end. That's the last thing they do. And see the argument? And this is what I showed you 2 days ago. I showed that academic article showing that a lot of people just don't get it. They don't get this win-win thing. They think it's win-lose. They have a zero-sum premise. My gain causes your loss. Now, here's what's crazy. This is a Nobel laureate saying it. I mean, if it was just some freshman in Ec 101, passable. This is a Nobel laureate at Columbia writing a book about inequality. It's dangerous and can't even get this right. That the idea that the slices would naturally be different. Unless you're in like that company, member company 2. Okay, that would be an equal slice, but justifiably. The core proposition in economics is that voluntary exchange benefits both parties. The Nobel laureate in economics denies that basic economic proposition. Wow. And he's not the only one. There's a bunch of them that do this. And they're very popular. And interestingly, unjustly, they win prizes. I read this when I was a kid. It's very American. It's called The Little Red Hen. But it was written in 1874. There have been versions of it since, but 1874. If you know 1874, it's like right in the middle of the golden era of American capitalism, when the government was very small and there was no Federal Reserve or income tax or anything. And it's for kids. It's for kids in kindergarten, something that Stiglitz didn't read. And you know what the story is? It's very cute. It's only like 25 pages. The Miss Hen comes and she says, I'm going to bake bread. And she explains to the other farm animals all the things, the stages that are going to be necessary. We're going to plant some seeds. That will take some time. Then we'll harvest the wheat. Then we'll mill the wheat. Then we'll cook the bread. You see the whole thing. But at each step along the way, she says, you want to help? And the pigs and the cows, no, we're not going to help. No. And it goes on. Okay, I'm ready to harvest. You're going to help? No. The punchline, which isn't a very funny punchline, but at the end, the bread comes out, and the animals come out, and they can smell it. And they smell it. And she says, this is my favorite part, would anyone like to partake and eat my bread? And they're all like, yeah. And she says, no. It's the end of that's it. That's how the story ends. She apparently unabashedly says, no, you didn't contribute to the... I don't know if you can get that published today. It'll be seen as very heartless and very... Marginal productivity theory in a kindergarten book. Before he wrote Marginal Productivity Theory in 1899. AOC, she's like the Evita Peron of America. I'm not here to villainize billionaires. I'm quoting her here. I'm not here to villainize billionaires and say that they're inherently morally what? Corrupt. But, here's the but. No one ever makes $1 billion. You take $1 billion. It can't be justifiably made. It's taken, stolen. The system we live in, the life in capitalism, always ends in billionaires. They make money, she slipped up there. But she recovers, because it's off the backs of undocumented people, single mothers, black and brown people, those being paid under a living wage. So, by exploitation. By the way, notice being underpaid. I explained that a couple days ago as the Marxist theory of how labor is exploited. You didn't make those widgets, did you, billionaire? You employed thousands of people and paid them less than a living wage to make those widgets for you. This is straight Marxism. You didn't make those widgets. You sat on a couch while thousands of people were paid modern-day slave wages. We have real modern-day slavery in our system today, unquote. This is an elected official from, I don't know, Queens, New York or something. The big star among the young on the left. What is this? The dress has tax the rich on it. As she goes to the Met, a very rich people fundraiser at the Met, and she goes with tax the rich. See the betrayals? There's thousands of cartoons like this, but this is a more recent one. But during the 1800s, late 1800s, this kind of stuff was common. Big fat guy got there by exploiting all these people. And there's the pie again. The pie thing comes up. They beat the pie thing to death. He's eating the pie. What does it say here? The bottom 90%. You see, you could barely see they're all like sheep being slaughtered. Motivations. This is not always an easy one. What motivates people? Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Yeah.
I understand that we are not all equal by colors, skin, wealth, and all of that. But when I think about the pie,
Yeah.
I do believe there's pie.
Yes.
Yeah.
Actual pie, yes.
Exactly.
Oh, I'm not denying that, yeah.
Think of, let's say, example, generational wealth.
Yes.
Like the Memorial family, they've always had, however, I don't think there's any other person that's been to go into that position. So then you have the poor people who are always going to be poor too. So when I think of the pie, I think of that, then you see someone that came into wealth, worked for it, is giving down from the first generation, and you spend it recklessly, and all of that. So I believe this also goes to redistribute to the poor people, not the way she's saying it, it's the rich, because I know there's some people that have worked for what they have.
Right.
I kind of believe that there is the pie, and people have the wealth.
Yeah.
To them, like the silver spoon.
Right.
It's only fair to redistribute.
Right. Yes.
So I also really sort of that.
Yes. No, I'm glad you said that, because of all, if you were to press on all these arguments, you said, like, what is the hardest argument, or what is maybe the weakest argument, or the toughest argument to make? It is that argument that, can you bequeath your wealth to others? Now, I want to just make an exception for the royal family, not to defend them, but if you're royals, that's not out of capitalism. That's a leftover from the British monarchical system. So we could blame the Brits for why, but the Brits, by the way, not only keep the vestiges of that system, they love them. That's weird. Why isn't there, have you noticed? They love royal weddings and royal this or that. They're obsessed with them, which is kind of funny, because in today's egalitarian world, you'd think they would present those people, not British financiers or British industrialists, but they hate British industrialists and love these loser family members in the Windsor family. But no, you make a good point. But so just a couple things. One, the argument, the right of the maker of the wealth is paramount. So the issue is not the recipient and whether they deserve it. So that's point one. And you'd have to ask, why are people passing on wealth to worthless? So, well, they love their daughter, or they love their... But a lot of it is they love their foundation. I mean, sometimes they'll give it Rockefeller and Ford, the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation. Some of them will engage in philanthropy. And that's perfectly legitimate. Some of them feel guilty. Many of them felt guilty, so they give the money away just to relieve themselves of guilt instead of giving it to families. They'd build Carnegie Hall and Carnegie libraries instead of giving it to the Carnegie kids. But the other issue is you still have to make that extra step of, if the heirs don't deserve it, why would the strangers, why does the state have a moral legitimacy to take, because of this argument, precisely because of this argument that the heirs are worthless, in my estimation, of course, not in the parents' estimation. But the next step is, so why would anyone else deserve it? And I heard your argument. The argument would be because they're poor. So that's an argument that basically says need is the standard. If they're in need of it, the argument's done. But that argument would justify the redistribution of income across the board, which it has. So see, it's going to be hard for you to say, well, I'm just saying this about inheritance. Like if you said, I only want an inheritance tax, nothing else. The principle you're naming would apply to everywhere. Someone is in need, find as many taxes as you can. That's why everything is taxed now, property and income and sales. But it's a good point. You guys heard that point. Yeah. Okay.
It makes me realize about nepotism.
Yeah.
Like, if suppose there's a person who has not come from the wealthier family,
Right.
they really work hard to be where they is.
Yes.
So he would definitely not want to share his resources with somebody who's external to him.
Mm-hmm.
So this brings the topic about nepotism. So you would definitely want all their teachers to go to this next step.
Right. Yeah, so nepotism, it is an example of extending it to family and friends or whatever, but it's an admission that these people aren't competent enough to run the business. So nepotism often leads to like failure. This happens in restaurants all the time. So like from an economic standpoint, setting aside the moral argument that you have a right to receive it, that principle does dissipate the wealth and redistributes the wealth without the government being involved. If you give a bunch of money to a worthless heir and they dissipate it, that person in effect is redistributing the wealth on their own. They're losing money and they're spending it at Tiffany's and then the nightclubs and stuff like that. So it is a kind of redistribution that happens all the time. And then he has nothing left to give to his heir. Right. Yeah. So we have about 15 minutes left, so let me just sum up some of this and a couple of more slides. And just wanted to point out that as far ago as 1968, Ayn Rand was noticing this increasing egalitarianism and attributed it in part, not solely, but to envy. And the opening is interesting. She says, a culture like an individual has a sense of life, an emotional atmosphere created by its dominant philosophy, by its view of man and of existence. And it represents a culture's dominant values and serves as a leitmotif of a given age, setting its trends, setting its style. So Professor Hicks, just prior to me, talked about the Enlightenment, the important role of the Enlightenment in curbing and getting rid of slavery and racism. That's what she's noting here. She says, and it was called, it's not her phrase, the Western civilization had an age of reason and an age of enlightenment. In those periods, the quest for reason and enlightenment was the dominant intellectual drive, dominant, not sole, and created a corresponding emotional atmosphere that fostered these values. But here now in the late 60s, she's saying now we live in the age of envy. That emotion, that sense of life in our culture, it's all around us. We are drowning in it, and it's almost explicitly confessed by its more brazen exponents. Yes, you could hear, I quoted some of them. Yet men continue to evade its existence and are afraid to name it. What did she name it? Envy is hatred of the good for being the good. That's paradoxical. Suppose I hated a murderer, or I just hated a lazy person, or a socialist. I've been known to hate all of them. This is different. This is, she's successful. I hate her. She's actually achieved something. by my own kind of internal recognition, I resent that. And not just that, I wish he would fail. What's it called in Germany? Schadenfreude. The desire to tear down the good because you feel inferior in some way. We can't get too far into psychology here, but envy is an emotion. But it's, by the way, it's one of the 7 deadly sins, so religion gets some things right. So that's an interesting insight into when you hear an egalitarian argument, a leveling argument, a redistributing argument, some of it is definitely grounded in envy. No one wants to admit that that's their motive. So they'll say a whole bunch of other things like it's on, you didn't choose your parents, and they'll dance around an argument that fundamentally is sometimes grounded in just their envy of the success of others. Here's a famous another lefty who did that. Any questions while I'm skipping ahead? Oh, here's a, yeah?
Can you say a bit about the pie, since you brought up the importance of understanding like the pie metaphor?
Yeah.
And I think the fact that the pie is seen as a set size.
That's the first
and
false premise.
That's a slice of
Yeah,
pie.
yeah.
Like at this moment, this is what that is GDP.
Yeah, the idea of a picture in time.
It's a picture in time.
Exactly.
But because of the marginal productivity of wealth, like this wealth creation, when you look at it through time, as long as you're letting people create and produce, the pie is actually getting bigger. So that each slice, if you have a slice of it, it actually is a greater amount. So that it's going to kind of growing the pie over time. You go from a medium-sized pizza to an extra large.
Yeah.
Kind of view, so that it's not. There's a lot of ways in which the static assumption is across multiple dimensions.
Yes. So notice it captures 2 features. That thing I said about roles, and knows that one has a photograph of the girl in the car at a point in time. That's like the pie. And who's got what? And we don't need to talk about how the pie got there. Well, that's convenient, because only when you talk about who got the pie there can you begin to talk about who gets to be paid what properly, right? So one of them is this fixed premises, but the other one is zero-sum game, and then they're. But then the last one is society did it. There's this amorphous thing, society built the pie, and therefore we can't distinguish between who gets different slices and why. And yet business does this all the time. Markets figure this out all the time. There are compensation committees among CEOs. They're not going to overpay for stuff they don't want to overpay, all self-interest grounds. So there's the fact that it's so decentralized, and you have annual review. When you go into companies, you have annual reviews, and people assess what you did. Is it absolutely perfect? No, but these are millions of decisions are made every day, especially in for-profit organizations, not so much in non. Who did what and why, and who should get paid, and who should get bonuses, and who should not, and who should be demoted, and who should be fired, right? The justice is going on, if it's done right, all the time. And if so, at the end of the day, when you see these broad statistics of distribution of income, it's not arbitrary. It's a series of very objective decisions made by millions of people who were self-interested to make the right decisions. Bill, did you have a comment? Or?
Yeah, very quickly to that. So it's a hereditary.
Yeah.
Very true that it's like for the wastrel and the rich, if you get rid of the bequeath.
Yeah. Inheritance, yeah.
So, but it say there's no right to that, so you can take that now.
Yeah.
That's going to apply to us supporting until so they're going to apply to people like me, like who their wealth should their disabled daughter.
Right.
But now there's step 2 to this. So now that we've ended a right to hereditary or inheritance.
Right.
Now it's a political decision of how much you take and where it goes.
Yeah.
Well, the rich and powerful still exist.
Yeah.
So who now is going to determine the tax codes and the distribution of income?
Right.
It's not going to be me. So in the end, by taking away the right to inheritance, you've actually done me in.
Right.
Because my money is going to get taken, and I'm going to have no say in how anything gets distributed.
Yeah.
Rich and powerful are.
Yeah.
And they're still going to determine the system.
Yeah.
Money. And that was my God's point about the multinationals, like in Nigeria and stuff like that. That when there's no right to entrepreneurship or no right to property or no right for the entrepreneur to hire and fire, it's the small person that gets hurt. The multinationals, one way or another, will still get around that. And this is why it's important to have the right to hire and fire. Yes, the multinationals would then have the right to hire and fire, but then so would all the small entrepreneurs that need it. So her argument and what I'm offering here is that actually we can get rid of the right. Initially, it will affect your hurting the wealthy top. You know, it wouldn't be irrelevant. But in truth, you're actually hurting the small person because you've eliminated the only defense they had.
Good point. Yeah. Good point. You reminded me, and it's worth pointing this out quickly, a bestseller, Piketty from France. This is 2014, so about 10 years ago, but he's followed it up with a book on history of equality, really a history of egalitarianism. Notice his view of capitalism. It automatically generates arbitrary and unsustainable inequalities. Here's the key, that radically undermine the meritocratic values on which democratic societies are based. The risk of a drift toward oligarchy is real and gives little reason for optimism about the future of the U.S. Now, this is interesting because just as Obama and others invoke the American dream, trust us, we're trying to restore the America. Notice what he's saying here. I'm for meritocracy, and capitalism threatens it. I'm for meritocracy. Merit? It sounds like he's for desert and earning. Is that what inequality is threatening? And oligarchy, or sometimes called plutocracy instead of democracy. Demos is people. So democracy is ruled by people. You don't know whether they're stupid people or vicious people. They're just people, the majority. So there's no guarantee of liberty, right? But what's plutocracy? Ruled by the rich, ruled by the wealthy. So that's what the left says today, right? The rich and the cronies are taking over. We're losing, it's a threat to democracy, right? By the way, what remedy does he have? He wants to go back to 80% tax rates. It used to be 80%. They went down to 40%. He wants a 10% global wealth tax that's never been imposed. This is confiscatory. Here's my point. Here's the same quote. In fact, I argue that the oligarchy that he's pretending to worry about, it actually comes from democracy. How weird is that? I'm trying to protect democracy, but what is democracy? If you get unlimited majority rule, trying to gang up on the minority and tax them to death and regulate them to death, guess what the rich and powerful will do? They'll go to Washington and they'll start bribing people. And they'll hire their tax accountants and their tax lawyers. I mean, this is just so obvious, right? And so it's almost like you're asking for it, brother. You know, you think you can gang up, the 99 can gang up on the 1%. Well, you might, and actually they are heavily taxed, heavily regulated, heavily trust busted. But they're also super motivated in a way they never would be before. If there was equal protection under the law, they wouldn't bother to go to Washington. They'd be treated equally. The reason they're motivated to go there is precisely because they're being attacked by these democracy mongers. Do you get that? It's kind of a paradox.
You know when the real theocrat starts.
Okay, let's. Stephen, you had a map, so I had to put up a map. I'm trying to compete with my colleagues here. The social scientists measure everything. So here's a map that measures how unequal, if it matters. I don't think it matters, but how unequal income is around the globe. And if it's darker, it's less equal. I mean, it's more unequal, but it's a patchy story. But they start to measure this. They try to measure this. But again, these measurements, they don't care what the cause is. Not really. They'll just look at this and say, trouble, problem, redistribute. Maximum equality would be 0. As the the bunch of yellows up here, yeah.
Czech, yes, Sweden and Czech.
Now, I did a correlation once of all the ones that have the highest inequality. They're the richest, fastest growing countries. So back to that idea of you could lower the inequality on all these if you want less rich. And some of them will say that. Yes, I'd rather let less rich, especially if it reduces the carbon footprint. Less rich, less wealthy. This stuff is even weird. So I won't do that. I'll just go home. No, I mean end. So that's all I have to say.